I am talking to one of our Westar scholars, Dr. Hal Taussig, and I was interested to talk to you, Hal, because this new translation of the New Testament came kind of into my actually my Facebook feed was where I first saw it, and so something that I was interested to hear more about. And the book is called The New Testament, shocking, a translation, and it's by David Bentley Hart. And now, Hal, you have a book called The New Testament, which is slightly different, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, I would just love to hear a little bit about kind of the synopsis of this type of translation and what Hart is trying to do with the work that he has put forth in this new translation.
Well, Alexis, first of all, thank you so much for focusing on Hart's new work. I think it's a real salute to his work and the possibilities for you to ask me to think about this. And I had seen the work initially, but it's your question that has made me look at it intensely. So Hart calls his new translation of the New Testament almost pitilessly literal in its translation. So he goes at the translation looking at what individual words mean in the Greek of the first century. And he doesn't try to smooth them out. He wants just to get the kind of the raw language of the first century in the Greek and let us think about meanings from that text with us stopping to make it sound pretty or having better grammar than it does or being smarter or deeper than it is. And so it's a very, very ambitious and creative thing to do, deeply grounded in scholarly Greek translation. And it turns out that a lot of the times that other translations have translated the New Testament text, they've tried to make it sound prettier or more modern or deeper or better grammar.
It reminds me kind of like when you might be reading a book about the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament, and the author themselves have done kind of their own work in translating little bits that they want to really critique, and that you get some of this like just really off the cuff kind of them trying to make the words understandable to us in the English language is kind of what it sounds like the whole of this text might be.
Yeah, and let me, if I may, there's a quote, Alexis, that he has that's got too many big words in it, but it's really beautiful in some ways. What he says what he's produced is a kind of wildly indiscriminate polyphony. And he calls it says it's something like an early Baroque vocal trio, or an Appalachian band.
So all these kind of things that are coming together, and
and where they don't mind rough edges.
Interesting. So we talked a little bit about kind of this endeavor to take on this large project. So how does that actually play out in this translation? I mean, do you think that he's able to achieve this goal? Or does it fall flat, or maybe somewhere in between?
Well, I just want to credit it a lot for trying. In the end, I think I'll say that a bunch of us need to be doing what he's doing for the full project to happen. But so, for instance, he very few, if any, translations of the New Testament use the word eodios and translate it the way it's supposed to mean. Eodios is always translated in almost every translation as Jewish. But there is no such thing as Jewish in the first century. So he, like only a very few scholars, translate this Judean meaning one kind of belonging to Israel. In the first century. So
Sure.
that he does that is really wonderful, I think. And he's got other really wonderful examples. So for instance, the word Messiah, or the word Christ, which in the Greek is basically the same word in almost all of the cases. Both Messiah and Christ are what we call transliterations. It's just the Hebrew or the Greek put into English.
Right.
And all of a sudden that takes on all kinds of religious meanings over the centuries.
Right.
He has given us the real Greek translation, which is anointed, the anointed one. Now, it turns out that a lot of different people were anointed in the first century.
Sure.
So the anointed one is a much more helpful way of getting close to the New Testament.
Yeah, yeah. Those are interesting. What is your thought in terms of where there are places that maybe he could have been more faithful to these examples, to the text as you see it, the original, maybe doing a little bit more of that as opposed to kind of maybe falling back into old patterns of trying to smooth that out?
Thank you. Well, so for instance, there's John the Baptist.
Right.
He stays with that traditional translation. Okay. There were neither Baptists nor Christians.
Right.
At that time. So John the Baptist was a self-identified person belonging to Israel. And now we hear him, John the Baptist. First, we have to, say, hey, that's not really a 21st century Baptist.
Right. Yeah.
But secondly, the word baptizo in Greek, that means bathing. So really, if we followed Hart's example and what he wants us to do, that would be John the Bather.
Sure.
And very similarly, in other terms, we have where Jesus, a really wonderful thing he has done, where Jesus is named on the cross King of the Jews, is King of the Judeans. That's really different. On the other hand, for instance, the word faith, which has so many different meanings, there have been some better translations now of what that really means. But basically, the Greek word pistis, he translates only as faith. It often in a text, like in the woman with the flow of blood in Mark, Jesus says, is healed by her faith, by her pistis. But actually, she's crowding in, trying to touch people, and it's not something a woman bleeding should be doing, and trying to touch Jesus. And Jesus really, using pistis, the translation should be, it's your confidence.
Okay, sure.
Because the word pistis ordinarily, as Hart would have it, means confidence. And he misses it.
Okay, so there's maybe a little bit of selective, I don't want to use the word reductionism, but bringing it back to the original, but maybe in a little bit of a selective manner, per se.
Well, yeah, it could be. And so, for instance, he has this wonderful introduction to what he's doing, and it really designs, I think, what people should be doing for the next 20 years. It's really wonderful. But in that, he himself slips in the way he thinks about it. He stops talking about Jesus and makes Jesus the Christ in what he's talking about. And so he slips into his own religiosity rather than, even when he himself wants us to be careful about imposing theological categories on the translation.
Yeah.
And so and again, we all do that. So I don't want to wag my finger at him for that particularly, but we scholars, when we try to serve the public, we try to hold back on what we think so much as what we discover as linguists and historians.
Right, right. So, I mean, it sounds like it's maybe overall a good starting point for a lot more work that could be done, as
I would
opposed
say
to the
even
final.
more.
Yeah.
We as scholars, he and I and others, we need to assess what he's done, but we need to simply really claim his process and thank him for that. Now, I would want to say also that there is a translation that Westar Institute has done quite some time ago that does a lot of this as well.
Right.
And the Scholars Translation is a translation that does a lot of this, but was done by a larger group of translators. And frankly, I think that in many ways, the Scholars Translation done by this Westar group simply had more brain power in the room.
Sure.
And we at Westar are always very interested in doing things collectively, getting scholars to work collectively. Now, Hart says that when scholars that are translators get together, they always water down the translation. Okay. I think that that may have been the case occasionally for the Scholars Translation by Westar, but often it's more careful and more imaginative.
Sure, and probably guard a little bit against what you're saying about not maybe being able to see some of your own blind spots where you're coming to the work with these parameters, but not maybe being able to see where you're not following your own parameters. You have someone else to kind of say, hey, we need to get back in this, go in this direction.
Oh, that's so important. Yes, because that is, I mean, in Westar, that's really a lot that happens so often is we get corrected by one another because we are in groups of scholars that listen to each other.
Right, right. And then, I mean, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss a little bit about your version, the New Testament. And I know there's considerable differences in that you were kind of taking this collaborative Westarian endeavor into bringing some more newly discovered texts into the New Testament versus Hart's effort to just take what was canon so far and kind of retranslate it. But I think you've talked a little bit about kind of coming from similar perspectives of wanting to take these scholarly ideas and bring them forth to the public. So I'd be kind of interested to hear about what you think some of your similarities and differences might be with the work that you've done, although in different facets, but still around this text.
Sure. And just to say briefly, the project of a New Testament, and by the way, I prefer the title A New Testament rather than the, right. But that project was to add 10 books that have been recently discovered from the early Christ movement texts into the traditional New Testament, so that one could read alongside of one another things like the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah, which is awesome.
And so there, I think in many ways, similar things happen when you get a chance to read, let's say that the Gospel of Truth alongside of the Gospel of John, you suddenly open up to see that things are not so black and white in terms of what is important and not, but things that actually were recently discovered, but from the same era of the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, turn out to be really powerful in terms of their meanings and their spiritual principles. If readers of Hart basically get a chance to read King of the Judeans rather than King of the Jews, many of the harmful things that Christians have done about in terms of promoting a critique of Judaism doesn't happen anymore.
Right, right.
So I think that very similar things will happen in on the New Testament and this Hart's New Testament translation to actually allow us to get a bit more of the ancient world and some of the best of the ancient world and some of the ancient world that we need to rethink.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for your insights and taking the time to look at the book and chat a little bit. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure others will as well.
Well, you started it, and many thanks to you too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hal.